Hello. Well, good evening and good morning for those that are joining us online from abroad. Welcome to another installment of our Japan-Canada Research and Policy Speaker and Network Series, hosted here at Simon Fraser University. My name is Scott Harrison. I'm a research fellow at the David Lam Centre here at Simon Fraser University. It's a pleasure to have you join us, whether you're here in person or the folks online as well. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Simon Fraser University's Vancouver campus is situated and operates on the unceded and ancestral traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful to live, work, and learn on these lands. Today's event, From Artifacts to Advocacy, an Archaeological Journey into Indigenous Heritage Protection, is presented in collaboration with the David Lam Centre and supported by the Japan Foundation. This series aims to foster dialogue and deepen understanding of the evolving relationship between Japan and Canada, particularly in the realms of research and policy. The idea is to gather individuals in person and online who not only want to hear from Japan and Japan-Canada experts, and also have the opportunity to connect with each other, including the speaker and other audience members here today. Today, we're honored to have as our speaker distinguished Professor Emeritus George Nicholas, right here from Simon Fraser University. If you had a chance to read over his bio, I'm not going to do that here, but the extensive affiliations and prior positions, including Professor at Global Institute for Collaborative Research and Education at Hokkaido University in Japan, and Senior Research Fellow at Flinders University in Australia. Well, these titles do nothing to show his very long and extensive career, something that he will be talking about. I've asked him to kind of summarize how he got from where he started to where he's been and what he's doing now in a matter of just a few minutes. Well, a couple dozen minutes anyway. His talk is going to touch on his personal and professional journey as an anthropologically oriented archaeologist and his ongoing relationship with Japan and Indigenous Ainu peoples in Japan. Professor Nicholas will speak for approximately 50 minutes or so, which will no doubt won't do justice to his whole career by any means, and will be followed by what will no doubt be an engaging and informative discussion session following that. So for those that are joining us online, just keep in mind that your cameras have been turned off and you have been muted, but please feel free to use the chat function to enter comments and questions. This event is being recorded, and we are aiming to have it available for future viewing on the David Lam Centre's YouTube channel shortly after the event finishes. So without further ado, please welcome me, Professor Nicholas. Thank you.
Do I need this? Or?
You don't need it.
Okay, great. I'm delighted to be here today. Let me begin by acknowledging being on unceded Coast Salish territory. I would also like to thank the elders and community members of Indigenous communities around the world who've made me into a human being. And this is not working. Or can I just hit the keyboard? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'll just hit the keyboard. So what I'm doing this afternoon is essentially deconstructing my life to show you how I got from there to here. And keep in mind that all of these different parts are ultimately connected. And my starting point is Paul Gauguin's painting, Where Do We Come From, What Are We, Where Are We Going? And this to me encapsulates the three essential questions of what it is to be human and also what anthropology is all about. And two definitions. Anthropology is a study of all things human, from all time and all parts of the world. Archaeology is a study of humans across time and space through their material culture, through the things, through the artifacts that we have access to today. I'm an anthropologically oriented archaeologist. In other words, I'm an anthropologist who studies people in the past, but I can't ask them questions. So I need to work through their material culture. And many of my initial research interests, lithic technology, landscape archaeology, and so on, are traditional kinds of archaeology, science-based, empirically oriented, and so on. But there's another part of me, the more recent half, that looks at people's lives, past and present, through some very different lenses: Indigenous archaeology, social justice, intellectual property concerns, and so on. And this is very different from traditional archaeology. And yet I'm an archaeologist. So I've got these two different disparate aspects to my research. And I want to, this is from before. I want to basically share with you how I got to where I am, as I've already mentioned. So what are my origins? Mothers always know. Here I am with my mother at about 6 months old, visiting a cousin at summer camp in Connecticut. And all summer camps in Connecticut had a Native American name of some sort. And here I am wearing a feathered headdress. So somehow my mother knew that my career was heading in that direction. And I grew up in a small New England town. My interests were initially science-oriented, watching Mr. Wizard's science program on television. National Geographic was a mainstay. I had a microscope. I had a chemistry set. No one in the last 20, 30 years has given their kids chemistry sets for good reasons. But when I was growing up, it was part of, science is a wonderful thing, let's teach our kids. I also had a strong interest in Native Americans and other indigenous peoples. I still have these books, by the way. And of course, an interest in archaeology. And the archaeology that I was first encountering was that of early to mid 20th century, King Tut, excavate the pyramids and all that kind of archaeology, mostly in the old world, but also Central and South America. Now, all of this is sort of apocryphal, but there's a family story that's been around, well, since then. That when I was about 8 years old, I announced at the dinner table that I was going to become an archaeologist. And my parents said, that's wonderful. And then there was the but. Because to them, archaeology was something done by affluent white males who could, have the money to go off and discover lost pyramids and golden idols with eyes of green jade and all of that. But nonetheless, they supported me fully in my interests. And when I finished high school, I was accepted in Franklin Pierce College in New Hampshire, but I started in the archaeology field school the summer after I graduated from high school because I got special permission. So here I am at age 18 excavating a 3,000-year-old archaic hearth or feature of some sort. And this really instilled in me, the love of discovery. But my interests were oriented to the classical world, the old world, to Greece and Rome and Egypt. And those ancient societies I read about in National Geographic. And so it happened, my honors thesis at Franklin Pierce College was on paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases in 18th dynasty Egypt. And with those interests in mind, when I finished my degree, I applied to the University of Missouri in Columbia into the classics program and was accepted there. But within 2 weeks of sitting in the museum drawing Egyptian vases, I said to myself, this is boring. It's lifeless. There's nothing in here but description and classification. So I transferred over to the anthropology department, and there I developed an interest in looking at how stone tool forms changed in relationship to environmental change over the course of 10,000 years. So that was the focus of my master's thesis. From there, I went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst and enlarged on my environmental archaeology interest to look at how people utilized wetland environments during the early post-glacial period, 10 to 12,000 years ago. So this was the focus of my PhD dissertation. And this is all straight ahead archaeology. Along the way, I had the good fortune to have each of my supervisors be a former journal editor. And they put me through the ringer with my writing, something I passed on to all of my students, as Rob and others will attest to become better writers and be able to communicate more clearly what it is they're thinking and want to say. And that in turn gave me the skills and the confidence to become a book writer and editor and journal editor over the course of my career. So this was a fairly standard, albeit multi-directional education. And then things changed. In 1987, my wife and I did a tour of the BC interior. My wife's an archaeologist and originally from BC. So we drove all through the interior, including to Kamloops, where 15 years earlier, she had excavated a pit house on the Kamloops Indian Reserve. And here I am with our first son, thinking that I'd hate to admit this, I'm in the middle of nowhere. You know, sage-covered, wind-blown, desolate area. Little did I know that 4 years later, I would be returning to Kamloops for one of the most formative phases of my life and my career. And this was at a small campus that SFU had developed in conjunction with the Cultural Education Institute that offered post-secondary education, focusing in anthropology, sociology, and a limited number of other disciplines to primarily First Nation students, but open to everyone. And it was a time of my career that every day I was learning something new. I was also at the time teaching as a sessional. I was in Caribou College, now Thompson Rivers University. And I remember the first class I taught on the SFU campus. I just finished teaching a class in Introduction to Archaeology at Caribou. And I came to basically give that same lecture on the reserve, and I knew within 30 seconds that approach was not going to work. Put my notes aside, and I began to have a conversation with these 13 students. John Jules, Percy Casper, Mel Seymour sitting in the front row of the classroom in the former residential school, all caps on, sunglasses, just giving me the eye. You know, who are you, white guy, to teach us about archaeology and our heritage? And it was an education that I can't fully describe to you, but every day I learned more and more. Including one day, a student came to me and she said, I couldn't get my term paper done. And over the course of years, I've heard all of the excuses. And so I said, okay, well, tell me about it. And she said, I can't get it done because my spirit helper left me. And my first honest reaction was to myself, gee, this is what I haven't heard before. And then that light bulb of deep understanding went on. And I said, yeah, I'm an anthropologist. And these are people with a different worldview, a different way of engaging with the world. And yeah, I'm fine with it. And it was the kind of thing that really helped me transition into a different way of looking at heritage and what it means to living peoples today. And so over the course of 16 years on the reserve, I was basically developed one of the first Indigenous archaeology programs in the world to teach Indigenous peoples to do archaeology on their own terms. And a good deal of this was science-based, but it was also dealing with the sociopolitics of archaeology and who controls heritage. And it melded these different ways of looking at the past, into a very effective, very rewarding orientation. In 1997, my colleague Tom Andrews and I published one of the first books on Indigenous archaeology at a crossroads, Indigenous First Peoples and archaeology in Canada. And in it, we defined Indigenous archaeology. This is the first definition as archaeology with, for, and by Indigenous peoples. And that definition still works today. But over the course of time, I've refined it a number of times, and this is a fuller definition. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can see some of the key points here. But basically, it's archaeology informed by and directed to Indigenous needs and sensibilities. And Indigenous archaeology has many different elements, many different aspects. Some of it is politically oriented. Some of it is cultural revitalization. Some of it is heritage management. And we could add another 10 or 15 onto this list as well, because Indigenous archaeology continues to morph, to develop in new, exciting ways. And over the course of the last 35 years, the number of Indigenous people who are engaged in archaeology, full or part-time, has grown exponentially. In 2010, I published Being and Becoming Indigenous Archaeologists, autobiographies of 36 Indigenous peoples from around the world. And it was a bit of a struggle to get that many. Others were invited, but they couldn't come through or decided, not to participate. More recently, I did a follow-up with my colleague, Joe Watkins, who's Choctaw. And just for North America alone, we had over 200 Indigenous archaeologists. And right now, the number worldwide is probably reaching well over 1,000. So we can only capture 60 new autobiographies in the new volume. So really, really exciting stuff going on. And it was coming out of my engagement with Indigenous peoples in working to preserve their heritage that I developed a more expansive definition of heritage that's not just based on things and places, that is material manifestations of the past. But if you read my working definition, it's about stories and songs and designs and relationships with other than human beings. And all these other manifestations and aspects of heritage as seen by Indigenous peoples that is so important to who they are. So it's not just about things, it's about the relationships that people have with those things. Now, working in cross-cultural contexts is not easy for a variety of reasons. Let me give you one story about making mistakes. So in 2001, I was invited to Flinders University in South Australia to talk about my work in Indigenous archaeology. And I mentioned my interest in wetlands, and there was a wetland archaeological site or heritage site near Adelaide that I wanted to see. So I contacted some colleagues who took me out there. And it was, just a great opportunity for me. The next night, I was invited to a Truth and Reconciliation dinner. Hundreds of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples there. And someone said, Richard Hunter is looking for you. And this is Richard Hunter, a Narrandjeri man from South Australia. And it took us a while to connect. And in the meantime, I was thinking, well, he probably heard I just gave a talk at Flinders and wants to talk to me about my experiences in Canada. We finally connected that night, and he laid into me and he said, how dare you go to my ancestral site without asking me first? And I was taken aback. It was my fault, but I had made the assumption that my colleagues had obtained the permission for me to go out there. And it was a very awkward moment. I felt, obviously, I should have known better. I should have, asked, do we have permission from the elders and so on. But in any case, Richard and I, reconciled. We spent a couple of hours together the night and talked about things, and we left on a really good note, really positive note. But I felt that I just hadn't done enough to sort of rectify that error on my part, something that I carried as a burden ever since. Here's the next phase of my life. Indigenous peoples and other marginalized and minority people have historically had very little control over their heritage. Heritage that's used to the benefit of dominant societies in settler countries and elsewhere. And this was something that I and a number of colleagues saw as problematic. So we decided to be proactive in addressing this. And this led to the development of the Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage Project, otherwise known as IPINCH, which was funded by $2.5 million from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Project I directed for 8 years. And these are the objectives of the project. Basically to identify what intellectual property issues affecting Indigenous peoples are, the intangible aspects of their heritage, to analyze how and why these emerge, to develop new policies and better understanding to avoid issues, and otherwise develop and provide resources for researchers, governments, and communities to work together in a good way in terms of what heritage can and should be shared and what needs to be kept private. This was an international consortium, over 50 academics, 140 associate members, 26 partnering organizations, including the Center for Ainu and Indigenous Studies in Hokkaido University. And we funded 16 community-based projects around the world. We had 6 major themes outlined here: bioarchaeology and DNA, cultural appropriation, community-based research, research ethics, Indigenous heritage law, and cultural tourism. The 16 community-based projects that we funded were wholly in the hands of the communities. They had complete control over those projects from start to finish. They made all the decisions. And here's an example of one of them with the Inuvialuit of northwestern Canada. They wanted the information contained in objects that were taken from their community in the mid-19th century and now in the Smithsonian Museum. They didn't want the objects back, they wanted the information back into the communities. Another is in Nunavut, our cultural tourism. How do you preserve Indigenous language and values and prevent them from being overrun by outsiders who come as tourists? We also funded a number of workshops and public symposia. In this case, Working Better Together brought together people from funding agencies and universities across Canada to develop a better means of evaluating research proposals and funding. In another public symposium and workshop, we explored DNA and indigeneity, bringing together scientists and community members to find common ground, but also to identify the issues concerning DNA and so on that were of concern to Indigenous peoples and develop means to bring those concerns into planning. And we also spent a lot of time and effort addressing issues of cultural appropriation, which is rampant in Canada and basically all over the world. A lot of people want to do the right thing, but they don't know what that is. They want to celebrate Indigenous heritage by buying shirts with Indigenous designs, but they don't realize that those might be in Canada, made in China, and those designs were taken without permission. So we developed the Think Before You Appropriate guidebook, which is available on the iPinch site, still active, that helps designers and consumers and artists, musicians, writers figure out what is and what is not an appropriation and how to go about getting permission for designs and so on in new products in a good way. So iPinch consumed a huge part of my life for a decade and a half. It took us 4 tries to get the money. Sure, from the beginning, liked our ideas, but they didn't like our methods, especially for the community projects of giving control to the communities. But after the 4th interview we had with them, they realized that we were right. And in fact, in 2014, we received the inaugural SHIRT Partnership Award for collaboration for doing exactly what we said we were going to do at the start. So there had been a sea change in this national funding agency's orientation to how do you deal with this kind of research. But post iPinch, I'm involved in 3 kinds of iPinch legacies. The first is outreach. How do you teach people? How do you educate people about cultural appropriation or aspects of heritage that may be totally unfamiliar to them so that they can make more informed decisions? So one way I've addressed this is writing for Sapiens, an online journal. In this case, I was asked to write about appropriation, cultural appropriation at Halloween. And every Halloween, you have people, white people wearing buckskins and so on, and calls in the media for stop the appropriation. My argument is Halloween is not the day you target for appropriations, every other day, because Halloween is a kind of cultural anarchy where anything goes. Also writing for the conversation that Indigenous sacred sites are a violation of human rights. So here is writing not for academics, but for folks who want to learn about heritage and other interests. As the conversation publishes on a huge array of topics. And one other that I published in the conversation was about how Western science and Indigenous science or Indigenous knowledge both contradict and complement each other. This one piece that I wrote in a couple of hours has had more than 500,000 reads. My life work, it pales in comparison to this one short essay, but the audience it reached has really hopefully made people appreciate that Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, is based on some of the same kinds of observations and understandings and analyses as Western science. Another continuing area I'm working in is ethics. And I continue to work with the SFU Office of Research Ethics, developing training sessions for their staff to refine and expedite research being done with and for Indigenous communities by SFU researchers. I was a member of the Ancient DNA Ethics Project that looked to develop new policies and protocols for researchers in North America to work with Indigenous groups, Native Americans, and First Nations groups for respectful analyses of DNA. And more Indigenous communities want to know about the life histories of their ancestors, but they want to ensure it's done in a proper way. And then making a ruckus, and I've been making a ruckus regarding Indigenous heritage for a long time. And most recently, I've been raising concerns about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is a wonderful set of aspirational guidelines. But there's the but. 148 countries signed onto it. And if you read the various articles of UNDRIP, it seems to point towards better days for Indigenous peoples. But the problem is putting it into operation. And here are 4 stumbling blocks that I've been pointing out. It's voluntary. The signatories signed on for giving a broad approval, but they never really read the fine print in terms of what they have to do to make it work. And what they have to do is give up some degree of control, at least, over their decision-making regarding Indigenous heritage. That's the big stumbling block, and it's going to take decades, I think, for it to be worked out. Another project was, I was invited to co-author a report by the First Nations, our First Peoples Cultural Council, to basically look at existing heritage policies in BC and evaluate them relative to Truth and Reconciliation recommendations and UNDRIP. And so that's what this report is. And then one other thing I work to bring to the public's attention is about the continuing loss of heritage sites. And these are the Bamyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, destroyed by the Taliban, or by ISIS, by the Taliban rather, in 2001. There are headlines all over the world. This was violence against history. Absolutely right. But I've made the argument subsequently that the daily loss of Indigenous heritage sites is violence against people. And I think this is an important lesson that people need to understand, that heritage is not just about things, but what those things convey, the stories and values and knowledge, and so on. For the last 16 or 17 years, I've been working with the Ainu, the Indigenous peoples of Northern Japan. And recalling, my early interest in other peoples through National Geographic and so on, I was familiar with the Ainu, the bearded, so-called bearded Japanese. Never could I imagine that decades later, I would be working with the Nibutani Ainu community. This is Mr. Kimura, head of the Nibutani Ainu Association. I call him my little brother. He just laughs and laughs and laughs. He's a big guy. And it was only in 2008 that the Ainu were finally recognized as the Indigenous peoples of Japan by the Japanese government. And since then, they have been sort of starting from scratch in terms of developing heritage policies, and trying to address the other kinds of concerns they have over their heritage, over their lands, their fisheries, and so on. And so I've been working with them in terms of some of these concerns, such as cultural appropriation. The Ainu want control over their land. They want control over their affairs. They want to share their culture through cultural tourism, but to do so on their own terms. They want their ancestors returned from research repositories, the University of Tokyo and Hokkaido University. They want to promote Ainu crafts. But they also have Ainu artisans who are melding traditional designs with new media. So there's a lot of opportunities they have, but also concerns about stemming cultural appropriation. And for this reason, they asked me to have our guide translated into Japanese. So it gives them tools by which they can, stop the sale of these little phone fobs of Ainu people, over which they often have no knowledge until someone says, have you seen this design on this T-shirt? And they said, we never gave permission for that. And I've also been promoting to the Nibutani Ainu Association the notion of historical ecology as a way to weave together all of the archaeology, the ecological research, fisheries management plans, landscape restoration plans, and so on, into a neat package. And this is something that they're very interested in. And I return in September to spend more time helping to develop this with them. Now, as an archaeologist, one question you are invariably asked is what is, the neatest, most exciting, et cetera, thing you've ever found. And I have two to share with you, but they may be a little bit different than you might expect. So I mentioned the oral history, the story of my announcement at the dinner table when I was 8 years old. I was going to become an archaeologist. And to me, I needed no proof of that. In the same way that Indigenous peoples don't need to have their oral histories validated. About 25 years ago, after my mother passed, my brother and I were getting the house, the family home, ready to sell. And one thing we did was we tore up the old carpet from the cellar stairs. And what do we see? On the side of the stairs were these strange geometric designs. And on top of the stairs, you'll see different painting episodes where you painted up to the width of the carpet at that time. There's one part of my brother's name, Bob, N-I-C-H, written with hammer and chisel. We were absolutely astounded. This was our archaeology. This was our past. Here's my brother, myself. But there's more. Because we took off a sheet of paneling. And what did we find? The word obsidian written magic marker on the side of this piece of wood. This was proof enough, not that I needed any proof. But an 8-year-old reading National Geographic about obsidian artifacts in the Maya area, that's my archaeology. The second story. So I mentioned with the iPinch project, we funded 16 community-based projects around the world. And one of them was with the Manning River Aboriginal Association in South Australia. And they were concerned that a very famous archaeological site known as Devon Downs had all the scientific information on signage for tourists. But there's nothing about this being an important dreaming site, a heritage site for the Madam River peoples. So we funded them to develop that kind of signage and basically to tell their story. And the co-developer of that project was Isabel Campbell, a member of the Madam River Aboriginal community. And she was here for an IPINCH meeting in 2011, 2012. And I was having a conversation with her, and I mentioned a story about Richard Hunter, because the Narrandjeri territory abuts where the site is. And I told her the story of my encounter with Richard Hunter, and she gets this funny look in her eyes. And then she said, Richard was my father. I still get chills every time I mention this, because Richard died soon after my encounter with him. And I felt I had never done enough. And yet 15 years later or 10 years later, here I was directing this project, which was giving money to basically his community, his daughter, to support their heritage needs, their goals, their plans. This was the most rewarding moment of my career, of making things right. So I've given you all these different parts of my life. And they mentioned they all fit together, but there's a number of things I've learned that sort of provide the glue and keep me moving forward. Indigenous heritage is not public domain. It belongs to someone. Access to and control everyone's own heritage is a basic human right. Indigenous peoples have received little benefit from research done on their heritage. Community-based initiatives can be challenging, can challenge colonial structures in the research process, but can be done without compromising the integrity of archaeology and other disciplines. And then finally, the tensions that emerge in working between different cultures, something I have been immersed in for the last 35 years, can be really, really uncomfortable, but you can't be complacent. They force action, and that's a really good thing. And 3 final points. So, archaeology is ultimately autobiographical. Who I am as an archaeologist, the questions that I ask, kind of work that I do, is based upon all my experiences, all the professors and teachers I've had, places I've visited, the peoples and communities I've worked with. All of that has shaped me to who I am. Second, academics, in fact, all of us as citizens of whatever nation we're part of, we have a responsibility to work to make things better. And finally, mothers always know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. Wonderful. So we now have about 30 minutes or so for questions. We can keep it informal. If you have a question, just throw up your hand. We can also take questions via chat for people online.
Do I need a microphone or
We can,
is this functioning here?
so everyone else can hear as well.
Hi, I'm Andrew Horvath. I'm affiliated with the UBC Center for Japanese Research, and I'm very interested in how you became interested in the Ainu, other than your reading in the National Geographic of a few decades ago. What was the reason that you became interested in, developed a connection with Hokkaido University? And also, what do you do there, and have you, in the time that you have been there, which are affiliated, which I understand is more than a decade, have you noticed any kind of developments, anything positive, maybe not so positive, in terms of the acceptance of the Ainu as a legitimate minority population in Japan, and how, if you've noticed any, how your colleagues or your or the Japanese people that you meet, how their attitudes have changed towards accepting a minority population in a country which doesn't believe that it has any minorities.
Thank you. I mean, those are all good questions. I mean, the first one is fairly simple in terms of, connecting with the Ainu, and that came about in 2009 through a conversation with my colleague Hirofu Mikado, who's at Hokkaido University in the Center for Ainu and Indigenous Studies. He had already established a relationship with the community at Nibutani, and so he was part of the IPINJ project. So he basically, identified the need that the Ainu at large, but in this case, the specific community had for trying to figure out what to do. And so my first, trip there was in 2009, and I was basically going every other year. And in working with any indigenous community, it often takes weeks, months, or even years to sort of not figure them out, but especially for them to figure you out. Something I learned, when I began to work in Kamloops, is that, the chief and council put me through the hoops to really see who I was. Could they trust me? What were my real motivations? So, back to the Ainu. So, the first series of trips was a matter of simply conversations about heritage, about their values, about what their concerns were. And over the years, and initially through the IPINJ project, we'd have sit-down meetings with them. And they would struggle to articulate what their concerns were, because this was all new to them. They had not in the past had the opportunity to sort of, claim control or to express a desire to control their heritage in terms of formal policies and so on. So in a sense, they didn't know the right questions to ask, or they would say, we would like your help with, these few things. And then some months later, those questions, those goals would change. So it's been a slow process, but I think we've reached the point where they're looking to develop, the kind of multi-dimensional heritage plan. It's not just about archaeology, it's not just about Ainu traditional knowledge, but the forests, the fishes, and the whole package. And that's why historical ecology, I think, is one way to wrap this up. As an aside, I mentioned with one of the books I edited, Being and Becoming Indigenous Archaeology, it contained a chapter by the Ashino sisters, who were Ainu, and they were both at that time involved in archaeology. But afterwards, they stopped working in archaeology. They found the environment unwelcoming. The Japanese archaeological community is quite conservative, as I understand it, let alone Japan as a nation, who don't really accept that Ainu have any rights other than what all Japanese people have. So that is, a lingering issue, and the degree to which UNDRIP is going to help untangle that I don't know.
Great, thank you. We're just going to take one question online, then we'll come back to you. So this question is from Lori Dixon Darkus. Says, amazing career, George. Curious, in your last two books about Indigenous archaeologists, through your editing, did you see any common themes? Or was every story unique?
The stories in those two books are astounding. In some cases, these individuals are the first in their family to have an education, or they have confronted families and community members who don't understand why they want to get involved in archaeology, which has the legacy of being the handmaiden of colonialism. And those individuals have at times been labeled coconuts, black on the outside, white on the inside, or apples red on the outside, white on the inside, for not being true Indigenous peoples. They bought into, the white Kool-Aid. That's nonsense. We've seen a big change over the last 30 years. We can no longer talk about archaeologists versus Indigenous peoples because there are more and more Indigenous peoples who themselves are archaeologists full or part-time. The stories also are astounding in their honesty about how people struggled, or how a young New Guinea archaeology student had her mother come and live with her because her mother wanted to support and support her daughter through the struggles of university. Or you have to read the stories, and in the process of editing them, can't tell you how many times I was wiping tears from my eyes and reading what these individuals had to go through. Now, some of them have gone and done straight ahead traditional archaeology, science-based archaeology. And in other cases, what they're doing is very, very different from traditional archaeology because it is based in community values, traditional knowledge, and with less a dependency on material evidence. So you're having archaeology done by Indigenous peoples on their terms. And it's really exciting to see the huge array of approaches.
Thank you, George, for that presentation. That was really fantastic. I guess for context for my question, so I studied for a year in Germany at an archaeology department there, and I felt a little bit disappointed by the lack of discussion around Indigenous issues there, and it just, I might be overgeneralizing, but it was my impression that in Europe, it's just the awareness of collaboration with Indigenous peoples in archaeology just seems much more limited and much less at the forefront of doing archaeology, in spite of the fact that European institutions do archaeology over the world. And so I don't know, I might be overgeneralizing, but I'm curious if, and it's also a shame because, European institutions get so much have so much funding and have a lot of social capital on the global scale. So I'm curious in your experience if that's true, and what your experiences with that have been, if that is true in your experience.
Europe is sort of a case to themselves because, who are the Indigenous peoples of Europe? It's very contentious. You could say, the Sami of Scandinavia, or Siberians, so depending on how you define Europe. in Europe and in many other parts of that region, heritage is strongly protected because it's their heritage. So in other words, Swedish sites and German sites and English sites have much stronger protection than those in settler countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, and so on, because it's their heritage. And here in Canada, for example, the dominant society's heritage is from somewhere else, yet they are the ones controlling, Indigenous heritage. Even in North America, the majority of archaeologists, archaeological organizations, still see Indigenous archaeology as sort of marginalized. And often suspect, because it may seem to be more political than it is about science. We could say the same thing about feminist archaeology. Among the new flavors of archaeology that developed in the last 30, 40 years, feminist archaeology and gendered archaeology. Gendered archaeology emerged to basically say, hey, there were women in the past. Let's look for them, let's understand their lives and so on. Feminist archaeology emerged alongside of that. Asking questions, but well, why has no one looked for that? Or why are there so few women in archaeology today? And feminist archaeology has an agenda of changing things so that it's no longer needed. In the same way that there's an overlap between community-based archaeology, which is all about bringing archaeology off the ivory tower and making it more democratic. Everyone can do their own archaeology. But Indigenous archaeology overlaps with that, but it also has a political agenda. So in other words, Indigenous archaeology is as much about communities as it is about the politics of archaeology and changing things so that Indigenous peoples are no longer unable to make decisions about their own heritage. I mean, it doesn't quite get at the core of your question, but it's probably the best I can do.
Wonderful. Next, I'll take another question online and then just have the audience here. So this is from Millie Creighton from University of British Columbia. Thank you for your talk. You've discussed heritage as a human right, making an analogy with cultural heritage. There has been established the idea that all cultural heritage in some sense belongs to all humanity as manifestations of the cultural heritage of humanity. Then there's the idea of heritage should be considered the cultural heritage of a specific group or people involved. Are both of these elements how you are interpreting heritage as a human right? If so, what is the interrelationship or the balance between the two aspects of heritage of a specific group or people, and this as a heritage as part of the heritage of humanity?
That's a great question that I've been struggling with for a long time. Because when we look at, just say, the archaeological record, or in this case, heritage more generally, if you recall, one of my slide headings was, mine, yours, or ours. And that's one of the challenges we have. We can look at the legacy, or we can look at the entire archaeological record of the world as being the legacy of humankind, something that we could all celebrate. This is what we did. This is what our ancestors did in the past. And this is how we all got to where we are today. On the other end of that spectrum is, this is my heritage, the history of my family, my lineage. And so on the one hand, you have the notion of universal museums and universal heritage. On the other hand, you have my heritage, my business. And there's no resolution for this. In other words, this is part of the tension that I alluded to, that I find myself in, or others, where how we answer that question has to be contextualized. do people have control over their heritage? Well, members of the dominant society tend to, but not those of minority peoples. And that is one of the problems of how do we seek the right kind of balance? Or how do you exhibit objects in museums that were collected a century ago that showcase or encapsulate some aspect of that society's culture, and yet that object is sacred and should not be shown in public. And in fact, if you go to Australia, many of the museums and galleries, there will be a sign that says, if you are a woman or an uninitiated member of the Gagaju, do not come into this room because there are things you cannot see, sacred, secret objects. And so it's important that all peoples have some say, Indigenous or otherwise, they have some say in what we want to share with you and how, and what we have to remain, what has to remain private. And we hope you respect that. So in other words, all, and then, this is one of the challenges. Academics think that all knowledge in the world should be ours. And for better or worse, that's not the case, and it shouldn't be the case. Because some things need to be private. In the same way that corporations have copyright patents on their intellectual property. They're not going to share with anyone because it's theirs. But Indigenous peoples cannot have comparable protections on the most important parts of their heritage. And that's why we have to, look to projects like iPinch and others to develop the means to work together in a mutually respectful and effective way.
There's some comments on the chat, but it's feeling about interpretations of archaeology in Europe and in Japan. So just feeding back into the conversation. Any other comments or questions from the audience? Yeah.
In your perspective, what are the
Can you speak up a bit?
sorry. In your perspective, what should be the priorities or perhaps concerns of research that wishes to incorporate both Western and Indigenous epistemologies, and how do you think those will evolve over time?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I've got poor hearing. Too much rock and roll.
I'm wondering if you have a perspective on what should, I guess, because it can be prioritized, but there can also be concerns around intertwining both Western and Indigenous epistemologies in academia and research. And I'm wondering, how do you think researchers should go about that process? And how will that process and the concerns and priorities change over time?
At the bottom of the answer to that is to ask the communities, what are your concerns, what are your issues, and so on. And one thing I discovered when I began work on the Tecumseh Reserve was they were really challenged. And I've got two former students, Jody and Advocacy, in here, who were in that program. We had been doing archaeology for a decade, and then we were told that one area of the river terraces where we'd been working was going to be a housing development. And I went to chief and council and I said, look at what you're going to lose. There's all these heritage sites and so on. And they said, yeah, we know that, but we need to address other issues as well. families without adequate housing, youth with substance abuses. And we need to address those. Those are no less, but no more important to us than the archaeology. And that was something it was difficult to see all those archaeological sites being destroyed. But what I learned and what I respected deeply was this is their business. And they're the only ones who can make those decisions in terms of what their priorities were. And this holds for all Indigenous groups or other marginalized or minority peoples. You have to ask them. And it's going to take some effort to really get the full answer from them. Because as I mentioned earlier, you go to them and say, well, I'm an archaeologist, what can I do for you? How can I protect your heritage? And they're wondering, well, why are you asking? Go dig up your own sites. Me as a white person, go to Greece and dig up my own ancestors. But I'm interested in Indigenous peoples and want to work with and for them. But it's really hard for many archaeologists and other academics to sort of put their own interests aside and be willing to take on a whole new research agenda. Many graduate students that I've encountered want to work with and for Indigenous groups, but really the only way they can do that is to go under the wing of an advisor who has already established relationship with those groups. Because otherwise it's going to take months or years to develop that relationship. And when you're a grad student, you've got a short timeline. Or the same thing for young scholars, young academics. You've got to get tenure promotion, and you can develop a project with a community, and then you have an election and a new chief and counselor come in, and the project that was accepted is out the door. So it's a very difficult area to work in. You have to have the right attitude, you have to have patience, and a thick skin. But most important, you have to be there to listen, to shut up and listen to what these people have to say to you. And that's really the kind of research that needs to be, or how research needs to be done.
Audience doesn't mind, I do have a question to bring it back to Japan. You've been going to Japan since 2008 or so? 2009-ish? So since that period of time, I'm curious what's the greatest learning that you've had about Japan itself, or about your relationship with Ainu? And if other people are interested in trying to engage with Japan or Ainu, what would they have to do? That's different than what you were already talking about.
Yes. Many Ainu communities have developed museums, heritage parks, and online resources, not just for other Ainu, but for Japanese citizens, and to some degree for non-Japanese folks. And with a little bit of Google foo, you can do some great exploration. And if you can't get to Japan in person, there are some wonderful books out there, as well as online resources and so on. There's also a kind of cultural revitalization that's going on with music, the Ainu Oki dub band, artists, clothing designers who are not only reproducing traditional designs and music, but melding them with new technologies, new materials, and so on. There's also many expressions of greater vitality among the Ainu relative to sharing their heritage and protecting their heritage. I mentioned the Oshino sisters. There are no other, since then, Ainu archaeologists, something that is both disappointing and perhaps not surprising given the climate we see in archaeology in Japan. But we do see Ainu communities gaining strength and capacity. And one example is what happened with the construction of the Nibutani Dam, which was built in the 1970s without consultation with the Ainu communities, many of whose heritage sites were destroyed. And several Ainu from Nibutani took the case to court and they won. The Nibutani Dam was declared illegal. Now, they didn't tear the dam down, but they provided huge resources for the Ainu in Nibutani to develop a museum and archive and educational programs that have really helped to solidify and expand Ainu education and heritage protection in the area. Now, 20 years later, a new dam was built called the Biratori Dam. It's a little bit confusing because the Nibutani Dam's in Biratori and the Biratori Dam is in Nibutani. But this time, the new dam was built with consultation with the Ainu. They were part of the planning process. You had a complete reversal. And so this is something that I think we could take, I was going to say great pride in, but we can be optimistic that things are changing in a very positive way. There's still lots to do, lots of work to do. One reason that, I've worked with one reason why the Nibutani Community and Biratori Ainu Association have invited me to various functions is because I'm an outsider. I'm a North American archaeologist. I'm a senior scholar, and that brings weight to their efforts. And they can use me all they want, but it helps them to leverage by giving them credibility in the eyes of the Japanese government, that they have all these outsiders working with and for them. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic in that regard.
Any other questions from the audience?
I've lost my voice.
Of course, but just if you have questions.
Yes, I was wondering what role, or I know that you're an archaeologist and not a linguist, but language resuscitation, or rather language, the encouragement of the use of indigenous languages is, of course, very much a part of revival of indigenous identity. Can you compare, or are you familiar with what's happened in Japan with the Ainu language versus what's going on in particular cases in, for example, British Columbia?
To a very limited degree, as part of the Kamloops campus, we had colleagues such as Marianne Ignace and others who were fluent in Secwepemc and other First Nations languages, and Mona Jules and others, taught those languages to the students there, to communities. The Chieftain School has Secwepemc language classes for youth. It's a hard struggle. Many of the native speakers have passed and so on, but it's a much more vibrant, much more viable effort in British Columbia, other parts of North America, than it is in Japan, at least in terms of how much progress has been made. I know there's efforts to bring in museum signage in the Ainu language. And the Golden Community Magna series is promoting, Ainu characters told in very respectful ways. So there's efforts to really further that Ainu in the broader cultural arena in Japan. But I simply can't speak really to the language question. But it is vital, to their cultural values.
Maybe we have time for one last question. If there's one. If not, we can also wrap up as well. So I do encourage you, if you have other questions now or later, you can reach out to George online. He's kindly agreed to answer every single question that we send him. Inbox. But just want to say big thank you to George for taking the time here today. So, also, we thank the David Lam Centre here at San Francisco University, as well as the Japan Foundation for very kind support to make this series happen. This is the last talk of this Japan Canada Speaker Network series until we start again in September. So we hope to take a pause over the summer, then restart again with support from Japan starting in September. So thank you all for attending, and thanks for those online for joining us.